If I had to pick my favourite TV show of all time, I would have a hard time thinking of anything other than HBO's Rome. Truly, I cannot be normal about this show. I have watched it so many times. It's one of those topics I can talk about off the cuff for any amount of time. I actually had a much longer and much more detailed video about Rome quite far along being made, and I scrapped it for a lot of reasons. The most relevant reasons were the way I was doing it and the way I was presenting it. They weren't the best way to do those things. Still, without that, there wouldn't have been either the Keir Starmer videos or the one on Fallout, so it wasn't a complete loss. My point being that I was quite a lot of the way through making a multiple hour video about this series, which should tell you just how much I have to say about it, which is why I've decided to challenge myself and confine myself to a single scene, one that contains within it almost all of the ingredients that make the show great. Before we introduce that scene, I want to give you a bit of a background on the show and why I like it generally and where it stands amongst other similar shows that came after it. The obvious comparison point for me is Game of Thrones, not just because they're both HBO shows or because they have the required HBO moments, which I will not show on the channel, of course. Yeah, there are a lot of those in Rome, but because they both set out to do something similar and be something similar, which is a slow-burning political intrigue that forces characters to confront the limitations of their morality or just indulge in their amoral calculations to achieve victory over their rivals. Then the dragons show up and it's a whole fiasco, but that's more Game of Thrones problem than Rome's. But Rome, to me, is a clear predecessor to Game of Thrones. I don't think we get Game of Thrones, certainly not the earlier, better seasons, to be as good without Rome. They're both facing the same challenges of adapting from material that's dislocated from the viewers, though in different ways. The late Roman Republic was real, so they tell me, whereas Westeros is fictional. But they're both places we can't go now. You have a lot of the same choices to make, and there's a lot of overlap with the actors. Just off the top of my head as I was writing this, I had Caesar, who's Mance Rayder, Varenus' wife is Ilaria Sand, Brutus is Edmure Tully, and I guess I'll throw in another fun one that's not related to Game of Thrones, but Levi is played by the same guy who played Barry in Four Lions, and his plan to incite religious conflict is basically identical in both of these. Speaking of media I can't be normal about, check out that video I did on it. Genuinely my favorite video I've ever done on the channel. Just to circle back, Rome and Game of Thrones actually have a lot of the same flaws in them. It's just that Rome speedruns them over 22 episodes in 2 seasons, though I will defend the second season of Rome somewhat here by saying that while the lows in season 2 can be much lower and they do make some bad choices with certain parts, like how many scenes are just meetings in Mark Antony's office? Not to make this about the history, because it's not the point, but read any account of Mark Antony's first meeting with Cleopatra and then compare it to the show, or Caesar's funeral compared to how they choose to depict it and transmit that information to us. Which, incidentally, they do the same thing in Game of Thrones as well. My point, though, is that because Game of Thrones became more removed from its source material, since, it ran out, it didn't have those same highs as it went on, which brings me to introducing the scene I think best exemplified why Rome is so great. There were so many I could have picked, genuinely an embarrassment of riches. I could have picked almost any scene, and I would have a lot to work with. Whether it's any scene with Varenus and Pullo being bros, anything where Caesar is clawing his way to consolidating his power, the conspiracy to assassinate him, or just Mark Antony. Unless he's in his office, which, as I said, I hate, but Mark Antony is genuinely one of the most entertaining characters in any TV show. I could watch him all day. Though my proofreader claimed she doesn't mind all the meetings in his office, and I realize I'm about to fire back at someone who can't respond, but my proofreader also likes the Borderlands film. So make of that what you will. I'm going to break with what you might expect a little bit, unless you recognize the guy in the thumbnail. The scene I'm thinking of is not one in the much more positively regarded first season. It's not one that's in Rome itself, and it's not even one that features any of our main characters or the group of characters we're meant to be sympathetic to. There are no Caesarians here, only Cassius and Brutus, and their hosts in what the show tells us is Bithynia. Now, this scene is quite well viewed on YouTube. I went looking for it, and it has over 200k views, which is obviously a lot. But it's not as high as a lot of the other scenes, like the compilation of the newsreader, which has 1.1 million, or even Mark Antony meeting Herod, which doesn't seem like that good a scene to me, because again, it's one that's taking place in the office. So, you know, I feel like I'm really losing it about The Office. We're gonna move on. The scene I'm talking about is mostly memorable for this line delivered by the Client King. I'm just gonna let him say the line so we can just get it out of the way. Here you go.
There are Roman women who are fucked by baboons.
And yeah, it's funny to see Cassius have to navigate this extremely awkward statement. It also works to illustrate how bad things have got for them, but we'll talk about that in more detail later. There's just a whole lot more going on in this scene than the funny, vaguely Middle Eastern coded man saying an outrageous thing and making someone uncomfortable. The clip of this scene on YouTube, for example, cuts off the back end of the scene, which I think adds a lot more to why the scene is so good and so exemplary of the show as a whole. What I'm going to do is very quickly explain where we are in the story and exactly what happens in the scene, so we're all up to date on that before I tell you why that's the case. I'm going to talk about what point in the story we're at when we're in Bithynia. We're in Season 2, which means we're after the assassination of Julius Caesar, only one of the most famous events to ever happen. Cassius and Brutus were two of the primary conspirators in that assassination, justifying it by claiming Caesar was a tyrant. I'm not going to get into that on this video, obviously. However, in the aftermath, a shady deal was cut to prevent prosecution of anyone and to let everyone keep their shiny new jobs. But of course, Mark Antony is Mark Antony, and they're exiled from the city. This is before the Caesarians coalesce into the second triumvirate made up of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Just as an aside, there's something very funny in the portrayal of Lepidus. So this show is what I would generally call timeless. It really holds up. One of the few clues we have into when it was made and by who and where is the way Lepidus is kind of a late 2000s English xenophobe. In every part of the show where they try to demonstrate Roman xenophobia, it's always in this language of racism that was very prevalent in Britain at the time it was made. Unfortunately, we've graduated to this stuff being so normalized that you wonder if it'd even be included as a way to sort of indicate towards Roman xenophobia, but that's a separate issue. I just find it funny looking back how much Lepidus is just 2008 yada. In fact, I'm going to show you the scene I mean just because I find it so funny.
I'll tell you who it was. Gauls. I wager any amount of money it was Gauls. They breed like rabbits, you know. No notion of working for a living. Thieves, a lot of them.
I just love how everyone awkwardly vacates the room. In some ways, this is a perfect encapsulation of what it's like to be around British boomers. Incredible stuff, and probably the only thing that reliably dates when this was made. Well, probably not the only thing, but it's the thing that stands out in my mind. Back to the topic. We're at this point where the forces that will fight the Second Civil War related to Julius Caesar haven't quite set themselves up yet, so Cassius and Brutus are trying to construct the infrastructure and funding required for their own army to challenge the Caesarians. Once we're past the start of the scene, helpfully telling us that we're in Bithynia, which they also claim is in eastern Turkey, which I'm gonna hold my tongue on, but we can see very clearly that they're not in Rome. I'm just gonna move on. We see a disheveled Brutus walking around as Cassius is engaging politely with the Client King, and I'm going to call him a Client King because that's the only way I can make sense of Cassius calling him stuff like excellency and who this guy is meant to be. Also, just look at this guy. Honestly, that's a king, right? He's clearly the guy with the power here, which is why he gets away with saying the iconic line and making Cassius clearly feel uncomfortable. That discomfort pays off since arrangements can be made, as he says. This weird guy gets to see the Roman woman and the baboon. God, I hate that I had to say that. That's genuinely one of the most awful sentences I've ever said that wasn't related to Keir Starmer. Then we get to the part of the scene that's not in the clips on YouTube, which is Brutus talking after far too many drinks about his role in assassinating Caesar, which his hosts seem to generally indulge in until he gets a little too big-headed and it almost comes to blows. We're not going to get too deep into that just yet, but there's a lot of pretty interesting stuff about this, and Cassius bails him out, blaming the wine and the heat, which, yeah, not a great combo, but Brutus is clearly lashing out in an awful way, which leads to this moment that's repeated, but with different characters, of friends bailing out their friends when they're too drunk and belligerent, which, you know, good to have friends who do that for you. The scene ends in a moment of care from Cassius to Brutus, putting him to bed as Brutus offers an apology for causing a scene and being rude to his friend, who's only trying to help. It's not a supremely complicated scene, it's not especially hard to follow, but what it is really good at the things the show excels at. The scene is around 3.5 minutes in total, which means this video is way too long, and that it's impressive for it to do so many things that make the show as a whole so good. Again, I will say that I could have picked any of around 30 scenes to do this video on, but none of them would give me the chance to go on the rant I'm about to go on, so I'm super excited. And none of them do this while being so separated from the conditions we would usually expect from a good scene. We're not with our principal characters, we're not with characters who we unambiguously sympathize with, because I think it's meant to be the Caesarians, and we're really spending time with characters who are defined by being the perpetrators of the assassination of the character who was driving so much of the plot forward in the first season. The scene could easily have just been Antony or Octavian receiving intelligence saying that Cassius and Brutus are raising funds in the East. Instead, we get this scene in a nice looking tent with a camel outside in the desert. Which brings me to the rant and to the thing that Rome does really well. Everything in this scene is wrong. Like, Bithynia isn't in Eastern Turkey. And even if it was, what part of Eastern Turkey do you mean? It's a big country, and none of it has, at least as far as I'm aware, recently looked like this. Which I'd say looks much more like what a European imagines like Iraq or Syria would look like. Genuinely, Eastern Turkey can look like all of this. Very little of it looks like the scene, if any of it at all. Maybe some parts of like Hakkari or one of the border provinces that can be very arid, but largely nothing like the scene. Like, none of Eastern Turkey looks like the scene. It's incredible. As for Bithynia being in Eastern Turkey, well, I've been to Bithynia. Or at least where Bithynia was. In fact, if you've ever been to the Asian side of Istanbul, congratulations, you have been to Bithynia. And you will note, Istanbul, notoriously not in Eastern Turkey. Okay, I had to go grab it. But I'd like to enter into evidence this famous Turkish soft drink. I don't know if you can see that very well. I don't know if you can see the name very well. But this very famous Turkish soft drink that I will take a picture of a bottle of in a second, called Uludağ. And that's what it's called. And I'm actually going to crack this one open. You probably won't get a picture of it. But you can look it up. It's called Uludağ. It's very good. Took 2 tries there. Oh god, that's so good. It's so good. Alright. Back to it. Which is named after a mountain in what was Bithynia, and means Great Mountain. And let me tell you, as someone who snowboarded on it, it is great. I've also seen it from the city of Bursa when I was passing through there, and it's massive. Like, terrifyingly massive. It also has another name. The Bithynian Olympus, which is a great way to move on to our client king, the baboons guy. He's clearly meant to be some sort of generically Eastern, non-Hellenized guy who comes across as kind of shady and debauched and overly keen on seeing women abused, and that kind of thing. And we're not doing that discourse in this video, but it's a way they've tried to emphasize how far from home Cassius and Brutus are. None of the inaccuracies matter in this scene. There are some, like how they portray Cleopatra elsewhere in the series, that do, and annoy me in many ways, but that's not the point of this video. I've intentionally gone hard on it to make this pivot, because what Rome tries to do is what every adaptation of any text tries to do. It's trying to create an authentic world that facilitates telling the story while maximizing all of the advantages of being a TV show or a film or whatever it is. The point of the scene looking like this and the client king being like that is that if this was a conversation between like a Hellenized Anatolian or Thracian person and Cassius and Brutus, it would just look like a lot of the conversations we've had in Rome, and they can get away with the inaccuracy because, let's be honest, how many of you knew where Bithynia was before I told you? I suspect for a lot of you, if I hadn't mentioned it, that this could have been Eastern Turkey, and it could have been Bithynia. The show does this throughout. It makes these choices, whether because the historical record is only so detailed, or because of production limitations, or just because you need to make certain things stand out, to compare to something completely different, but about the same sort of thing. Rome Total War, the original one, presents Egypt not as the Hellenized Ptolemaic dynasty, but as like Bronze Age Egypt, for gameplay reasons, but also because that's what we think of when we think of Egypt in antiquity. It doesn't matter that it's like 2,000 years off, at least from the perspective of someone who doesn't play as Egypt in that game, because that campaign looks brutal. In fact, Rome does kind of do that with Egypt as well, but I do know the Ptolemy dynasty leaned into the pharaoh thing, and also it's just not what we're talking about right now. The decision to focus on making it feel authentic, kind of vibes-based if you like, is why none of that stuff I talked about mattered. It felt right, even to me who knows it's wrong. Something that's done really well in this scene is the political aspect. It's really well communicated. Now, admittedly, in this scene, Cassius is trying his best not to say it, and the client king does just blurt it out, but then given the way that conversation goes, he seems like a straight talker, if nothing else. This show is primarily political, and being able to communicate what the intrigue is competently is essential. You don't want to end up like the Star Wars prequels, where yes, it turns out the politics is actually the plot, but everyone just wants to see the cool lightsaber fights. Not that there aren't entertaining scenes involving violence in Rome, it only depicts the most famous political assassination of all time, right? It's just not the point. It's a bonus. There's a type of person for whom a political intrigue is just not their thing, and so when we've been away from characters for a while, or they're not our sympathetic, and I hesitate to say this word, but protagonists, but they're certainly more fringe than a lot of other characters, it could be good to have a scene where everything is communicated so clearly that anyone could just grasp what's happening instantly. Sometimes you can just tell people what's happening if you make it entertaining enough, which this scene is. Speaking of things that are communicated well, something done well here is we get to see these two characters at a low point, particularly Brutus, but Cassius as well. They've been driven from their home, which is in the hands of the political faction they oppose, and they're being made to basically beg for favors. You can tell who has the power here, not least because you can contrast this with Caesar's dealings with foreign rulers, independent of Rome, at least nominally independent. We're not, again, not the point of the video, we're not getting into it. Do we think Cassius or Brutus have it in them to scream at the client king that someone was a consul of Rome? Another great scene, by the way. No, of course not. You can even see it in the moment when Brutus declares he's a Roman senator. These people don't care. You have no power here. Rome does this throughout the show. No character is ever on a completely positive trajectory, and we get these moments where characters try to cope with this. Maybe they cry, maybe they drink, maybe they take it out on someone else. Whatever it is, it's very human in that way, and by letting us in, it makes the moments where they turn it around, or when it does all finally come crashing down, feel that much more weighty. Not to spoil anything, but for Cassius and Brutus, this story doesn't have a happy ending, and knowing the torment they went through, especially Brutus, who's clearly trying to justify what he did and struggling with it, on their way to it being for nothing, it's great. And sometimes life is that way. You're not guaranteed, even if you do everything right and justify yourself, to get a happy ending. One thing you might have, though, is good friends. And this scene is great for establishing that Cassius cares about Brutus and that Brutus cares about him. I think we've all been there, where a friend spirals for whatever reason, and sometimes you need to be there. I've been there. I've been that friend who spirals. And look, I'm lucky I'm not trying to wrest state power away from my rivals, otherwise the spirals could have been really bad. Rome is probably most well known for being a story that centers on Vorenus and Pullo, who are bros. They're just the ultimate bros, right? Their presence and the way their friendship grows is one of the core delights of the entire show, but Cassius and Brutus do this as bit characters. Obviously, they're not on screen as much, they're not our principal characters. You still get to see glimpses of a really good and authentic feeling friendship. None of the relationships depicted in Rome are without their issues. No relationship in real life is free from issues. But one of the ways it sells that authenticity I talked about earlier is by having characters with these relationships that play out entertainingly, yes, but crucially in a way that some of us might find familiar. There's always this tendency to imagine people from the past as different to us in ways that they clearly weren't. Like, do you think chatting shit with your mates while having a drink is going to look that different in ancient Rome than to now, right? Probably not. Is showing up for your friend when they need you and telling them what they need to hear going to look that different? Also no. And does blurting out an apology for being a dick look that much different? No. That's what works really well about that part of the scene, and really something that lands across the whole show. That's really it. Obviously, this scene stuck in my memory because of that line that absolutely blindsided me the first time I watched it, and I love it for that. But a scene that is otherwise easy to overlook, perhaps easy to regard as forgettable, has a lot of what works well across the series in it. I'm probably never going to get to make that full HBO's Rome video I thought of making all that time ago, so this will have to do. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, that's it. I'll see you in the next one. Okay, I need to thank my proofreader who read this on very short notice and gave me some very funny notes, one of which obviously you heard earlier. I also need to say, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And I'm going to shout out the patrons and members, but if you would like to become a member of the Patreon, this is a good month to do it because there is a discount on for my birthday for the top 2 tiers because it is my birthday. And the code for that discount is SK32YO. Guess why it's that? But that is the code. It is valid until midnight after my birthday, I think. And yeah, just if you fancy joining the Patreon, you can get early access to videos, vote on the topics, access to the Discord, all of the good stuff, the usual Patreon stuff, right? But I need to thank the patrons and members, specifically the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Kersey Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Mubar, Carolyn, and the YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson. Thank you to them, and thank you to you if you're still around. I had a good time doing this video, and yeah, if you liked it, like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I'll catch you on the next one. See ya!